All right. Well, thanks for joining us today. It's great to see so many people posting what their legislative priority might be in the Discord channel. Um, so I'm just kind of looking for if anyone else wants to post in there, you can do so now. Just assuming the Democrats win the two Senate runoffs in Georgia in 2021, that would give the Democrats control of the White House, of the House, and 50 votes in the Senate, with Kamala Harris breaking any ties. So even if you're not going to put it in the channel, just take a moment and just think about what sort of legislation you would want to see the Democrats pass in 2021. Maybe that's the Green New Deal, Medicare for all. Really, the sky's the limit. I'm not looking for anything. What your practical answer to that might be, but just take a moment and really think about that. Sorry, 1 second. I might have to uh, fix these slides in a second. Sorry about this. Sorry, Keynote does not play well with Zoom. I've been learning. All right, so you're able to see the slide now? Let's see if that works. Okay, that works. All right. So I'm seeing a lot of great things, a lot of things about in the channel, a lot of notes about reforming education, about DC statehood. Um, let's see. A lot of stuff about voting rights. That's incredibly important in this country right now. A lot of great stuff. But the fact of the matter is that pretty much anything you could write down right now, anything you could think about the Democrats passing in 2021 is just simply never going to happen. And you might be wondering how that can be if I'm talking about a situation where Democrats control the Senate with 50 votes, with Kamala Harris breaking ties, they control the House and they control the White House. They'll control both of the political branches, and if assuming everyone in the Democratic Party voted in lockstep, shouldn't that be enough to pass anything that they want? Sorry. Well, the fact is, no, that's not enough to actually pass legislation in today's Congress. Because the sad fact is that even if progressive Democrats manage to overcome all of the obstacles in their way, the Electoral College, gerrymandering, the outsized power of small rural states, voter suppression, obstruction from moderate Democrats, it still wouldn't be enough. There's another hurdle to get over, and it's the single most important obstacle our country is facing right now, and that's the Senate filibuster. And until we actually get rid of the Senate filibuster, conservatives in the Senate will always be able to block a progressive policy agenda. So whatever it was that you wrote down, whatever you put in the channel, if you're just thinking about it as your number one priority, put that aside for now, because that's now your number two priority. Your first priority is getting rid of the Senate filibuster. Now, when most people think about filibusters, if they think of them at all, they probably think about something like this. A senator takes control of the floor of the Senate, they start speaking, and they refuse to stop speaking, and they refuse to sit down. And as long as they do that, no one can stop them from speaking. No, the Senate cannot move forward as long as they are standing and they are speaking. And this is usually done as a protest against a piece of legislation or to make some broader point about the legislation that's being debated. And these sorts of filibusters do take place in real life sometimes. In the bottom right, you'll see Senator Ted Cruz there is doing a classic kind of filibuster where he refused to let budget legislation move forward unless the Affordable Care Act was defunded. So we do see these sorts of filibusters pop up from time to time in real life. But when we talk about the Senate filibuster, these days we're actually talking about something much different and much more pernicious. Um, and to see what I mean, let's think about how a bill actually becomes a law in the United States. Um, oh, I'm sorry. One thing I should mention is that uh, the term filibuster is actually broader than you might expect. It's broader than simply taking the floor of the Senate and speaking until you can't speak anymore. A much broader definition of the word filibuster would include any attempt to use the rules to slow down, delay, or stop a process from moving forward. So as I talk about the Senate filibuster going ahead, just kind of get out of your mind that it's just this one type of action. There are any number of actions that can qualify as a filibuster, as long as you're using the rules to just kind of slow things down or stop them from moving forward. And so when we think about how bills become laws in the United States, you might have something like this in mind. This is an extremely simplified model of how that happens. But assuming that the president and the majority of legislators want a bill to pass and become a law, this is what it might look like. In the House and the Senate, you'd have some sort of bill that gets drafted. It would go through a committee process where there'd be hearings, potentially amendments proposed and voted on. And eventually that bill would make its way out of the committee and onto the House and Senate floor. There would be some sort of debate about the merits of the bill, but then eventually you'd expect it to move on to a vote. And if enough legislators vote for it, the bills would pass the House or the Senate. You might have some sort of conference committee after that where the Senate and the House work out whatever differences there are between their two bills. And then once that's done, you would have a final vote in the House and the Senate to actually pass the final piece of legislation. That would then go to the president, who would then, assuming that they wanted it to become a law, would sign the piece of legislation, and it would actually become a law. Now, this process is missing a lot of the finer details of how things work in real life, and there's plenty of places where things can go wrong. But in the abstract, it's really not that far off from how things actually work. Except for one crucial moment in the upper right-hand corner, at the point where the Senate debate stops and voting in the Senate begins. The problem is that in the Senate, in order to end debate and move on to a vote, every single senator has to agree to it. So if at least one senator objects to ending debate and voting on a piece of legislation, it takes a 3/5 majority or 60 votes in today's Senate to actually end debate. So passing the bill, voting on the bill, only requires a simple majority to pass out of the Senate. That's only 51 votes in today's Senate. But ending debate to get to that vote takes 60 votes. This is what we're talking about generally when people talk about the Senate filibuster. This is what they mean. It means that you can't even stop debating and move on to a vote unless you have what's typically called a supermajority in the Senate, 60 votes in the Senate to move on to the actual vote. From there, it only takes 51, but getting there takes 60. So you might be saying, okay, that's really weird, but maybe that's just how the Senate was designed to operate. Well, actually, no. The 3/5 vote requirement wasn't what the framers of the Constitution had in mind. It wasn't what the people who wrote the Senate rules originally had in mind. And it wasn't even really what any individual senator had in mind. The problem was created by accident, and it was created by Aaron Burr, uh, vice president at the time. And in fact, both the Senate and the House at the time had a rule that allowed a simple majority to end debate on an issue and either proceed to a vote or set the issue aside for another day. So then that would only take just a bare majority, 50%, to move forward to a vote. And that rule was known, it's a kind of arcane old parliamentary expression, but it was known as the previous question motion. Um, but in 1805, Vice President Aaron Burr, he addresses the Senate and he says to them, you've got all of these rules, you've got all these unnecessary rules and these redundant rules, and you should really try to clean things up to make things more efficient. And one of the rules he suggests getting rid of is this previous question motion. And so in 1806, the Senate decides to get rid of the previous question. And just like that, in the Senate suddenly had no formal way of ending debate. And not just for legislation, this included judicial and cabinet nominees and any other motions allowed for debate. There was no way, unless every single senator agreed to it, to end debate and move on to a vote. And that lasted for more than 100 years. There was simply no way to cut off debate. And I really need to reemphasize this. That was an entirely unintentional result of the rule change. In 1806, the Senate was still very new, and they were still experimenting with the rules and procedure. And they didn't have a tradition of what we now know as filibustering. So when this rule was removed, no one really thought about the fact that now you suddenly can't cut off debate, because generally the way things worked in the Senate is you would bring a bill to the floor, you debate it until everyone had their say, and then you would move on to a vote. And that's just how things were done. So it took a really long time for this to become a problem in the Senate. But eventually it did become a problem. Filibustering towards particularly after the Civil War, started to become an issue in the Senate. And in 1917, filibusters were being used to stop President Woodrow Wilson's agenda, including arming American ships in the run-up to the U.S. entering World War I. So it got bad enough that the Senate rules were changed. In 1917, the rules were changed to allow debate to be cut off with a 2/3 majority voting in favor. And then in 1975, that was eventually reduced down to the 3/5 majority that we have today. So with 60 votes in the Senate, you can cut off debate and move to a vote now. And the way that you do this is by invoking cloture. Now, cloture is another one of those arcane parliamentary terms, but it really just means you're bringing debate to a close. So when I talk about invoking cloture going forward, that's all I mean. The Senate is debating a bill. Some senators are refusing to move to a vote. And if 60 senators agree to cloture, that means that we're going to start bringing debate to an end. Now, that may sound simple, but one of the main problems with cloture, other than the 3/5 vote requirement, is that it makes every single thing the Senate does more complicated and more time consuming. So here's what the process for invoking cloture looks like. You may notice that just getting to the cloture vote takes at least 2 days. If you present the cloture petition on a Tuesday, for instance, you have to wait until Thursday to actually have the cloture vote. And then even after cloture is invoked, there's another 30 hours of debate in the Senate before getting to the actual vote. And cloture may need to be invoked several times throughout a bill's life cycle. So this kind of time constraint is a huge drag on legislative agenda. Senators constantly have to jettison less pressing matters from their agenda in order to make sure that they have time for the items that absolutely have to pass, that would be disastrous if they didn't pass. And that's if they have 60 votes in the Senate to invoke cloture in the first place. And perhaps maybe even more importantly, it just makes the legislative process harder to follow for the general public. It allows more opportunities to distort what is really happening in the legislative process. And it can often mean that votes on important items are taken at 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the morning, just because we need to get this bill done, and that's the earliest we can do it because of these cloture requirements. So it gives even really popular bills this air of like secrecy and that you're doing something nefarious in the middle of the night. It gives the bill's opponents a lot of opportunity to make it seem like something wrong is being done, just because that was the requirements of the cloture vote in the first place. Additionally, um, this problem has the cloture vote has only exacerbated the use of executive action by presidents to actually get their priorities done, um, and that's a problem for a number of reasons. For one thing, it means that whoever becomes president next can simply undo what the previous president did with an executive action. They just have to have their administration write it up and they sign it, and they can undo a lot of work from the previous administration. So there's a lot of swings from one administration to the next because of this. Um, uh, and also, there's just limits on what the president can actually get done through executive action. That those limits have been expanding over time. Presidents are able to do more and more through executive action, but still, there's a lot of things that can't be done through executive action and just need to be done through the legislative process. It's also giving the Supreme Court a huge amount of power because Congress can't easily respond to the rulings. Contrary to how it seems these days, the Supreme Court doesn't have to have the final say on whether a piece of legislation is constitutional. Um, a more efficient Congress could actually respond to Supreme Court rulings, make adjustments to legislation, and then repass a new bill that maybe excises a particular portion of the bill that was considered unconstitutional. Maybe they modify the language a little bit to be less ambiguous in cases where the Supreme Court interprets things in a way that they didn't intend. Um, Part of the reason why every opening in the Supreme Court these days feels like an existential crisis is because Congress isn't able to exercise its power to do those things. It becomes uh, the right now the Affordable Care Act is hanging in the balance based off of a very strange technicality in the language. I think it'll end up surviving, but if it didn't, um, a functional Congress could just change uh, literally like a single sentence in the bill, like a very small portion of the bill, to respond to how the Supreme Court responds in that, how the Supreme Court rules in that case. And we would still be able to maintain the Affordable Care Act even if the Supreme Court decided to strike it down completely. Um, so given all of this, you might wonder how the government ever got anything done. Um, a lot of legislation has been passed in this country over the past 100 years. If this was a problem since 1917, how did that kind of legislation get passed? Um, One thing that I want to stress here is that invoking cloture is not a requirement for passing legislation. It's only necessary when one or more senators objects to ending debate, and that just used to happen a lot less often. With the pretty major exception of civil rights legislation, which was often filibustered, uh, senators that were opposed to a bill, even very large bills, still allowed the vote to go forward. Um, this really started to change towards the end of the 20th century. Um, so some of the things that changed, that kind of changed and made the filibuster a much bigger problem. For one thing, Senate culture changed. Senate culture used to rely much more heavily on seniority. More senior senators maintained a tighter control over committee work, and younger senators typically deferred to them on legislative priorities. Um, but in the 50s and 60s, younger, more progressive senators from the North started to get elected and began pushing back on the Southern racist Dixiecrats that were then a part of the Democratic Party. And those Dixiecrats had a lot of power because they maintained their seniority by terrorizing Black voters in the South. It's a lot easier to stay in the Senate and achieve a high level of seniority if you're actively suppressing a large portion of the vote and and only allowing the people that want you in power to actually vote. Uh, but ultimately, once the more progressive senators started to push back on the importance of seniority, and it did reform did happen in the Senate. Seniority became less important, and Democrats started passing some civil rights legislation, and this caused the Dixiecrats ultimately start moving to the Republican Party. Another thing that changed just over time is just technology. Um, for one thing, a shift towards a national media meant that individual senators could start making a name for themselves by refusing to follow Senate norms. And since traveling home on the weekends became much easier, senators were also just spending much less time in Washington, D.C. when they weren't in session. Uh, they would stop hanging out with each other, even colleagues on the other side of the aisle, um, uh, over long weekends, and instead would start flying home to be home when Congress wasn't in session. So their personal relationships with other senators started to diminish, and it just became a lot less important if you were seen as an obstructionist. Um, Ted Cruz has been a major obstructionist in the Senate. No one in the Senate really likes Ted Cruz, but that hasn't stopped him from gaining a national presence. It hasn't stopped him from having a serious run for the Republican nomination for president. And it certainly hasn't stopped him from being an obstructionist when Democrats are in power, sometimes even when Republicans are trying to get things done. Uh, And then third, just as these changes were going on in politics, the politics across the country became more nationalized and the country just became more polarized. Uh, on average, the Democrats and Republicans used to be much more aligned in terms of ideology. There were Republicans that were more liberal than some Democrats, and there were Democrats that were more conservative than some Republicans. But as I said before, after the civil rights era, the Dixiecrats moved to the Republican Party, and ideologically, the party started to drift further and further apart. So these days, there's a lot less room for compromise between the two parties, and obstructing the other party actually becomes a really good strategy for preventing them from doing what they want and hopefully taking back the control of the government later to do what you want. And finally, just the filibusters themselves had changed. As cloture votes became more common, senators realized that they no longer had to stand and talk for hours and hours if they wanted to stop a piece of legislation. All they had to do was tell their party leaders, if this piece of legislation comes to the floor, I'm going to object to every motion and force you to invoke cloture, which, as we've seen, even if you have the 60 votes in the Senate, that can add significant time to the legislative process, days and days in some cases. And with a packed legislative agenda, most bills just aren't worth that time, even if you have enough votes to invoke cloture. So they're never even brought to the floor. There's never even a debate on pieces of legislation. All that's to say that Senate filibusters these days are just too cheap. Uh, it doesn't cost a lot of time or energy to be an obstructionist anymore. All it basically takes is a memo. This is an example of a memo. Senators on both sides of the aisle do use this tactic. But this is an example memo from Republican Senator Tom Coburn to then Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, just indicating that if the National Defense Authorization Act contains certain provisions, then he's going to object to every procedure at every step of the way. Now, if this bill has enough support, it will pass anyway, but it may not be worth the amount of time and energy it takes to get those to pass the legislation, and they may feel that it just they might as well just leave that part of that legislation out of the Defense Authorization Act. Okay, so if I've convinced you that the filibuster is a problem, the next question is, how do we get rid of it? Well, unfortunately, changing the Senate rules outright is subject to a filibuster. So we can take that off the table. Um, so that brings us to something called the nuclear option. And the nuclear option in practice is a little complicated to follow. But the thing that you have to keep in mind is that the Vice President of the United States is also the President of the Senate. And this means, for one thing, that the Vice President can break ties in the Senate. But more importantly, here is that the President of the Senate can make rulings as to how Senate rules should be interpreted. So let me break that down. Right now, the rules of the Senate clearly state that it takes a 3/5 majority to end debate. There's really no ambiguity there. It says right there, 3/5 of the Senate to end debate. But the vice president has the power to interpret that rule as only requiring a simple majority. And once the rules are interpreted in this way, it stands as a precedent for future votes. This is one of those just weird things about the Senate, that no matter what the rules actually say, the Senate has the ability to interpret its rules basically however they want. And this is essentially what the Democrats did in 2013. Republicans were in the minority in the Senate, but they were blocking basically every one of President Obama's nominees. And this started to become a real problem, both judicial and cabinet nominees. And so under Majority Leader Harry Reid, the Democrats used this technique known as the nuclear option to invoke cloture on non-Supreme Court nominees. So any nominee the president sent to the Senate, as long as they weren't a Supreme Court nominee, the Democrats basically interpreted the rules as saying you only need a simple majority to pass that nominee through. Republicans complained a lot about this tactic. And in fact, the reason why this is known as the nuclear option is because after the Democrats used this technique, the Republicans began requiring a cloture vote much more often. So they became even more obstructionist as things went on, as a way of retaliating against the Democrats' use of this technique. But in 2017, they didn't hesitate to use the nuclear option themselves to do the same thing for nominees to the Supreme Court. They wanted to get Neil Gorsuch onto the Supreme Court. This was a seat that Mitch McConnell had blocked President Obama from filling, and they only had a simple majority in the Senate at the time, and so they interpreted the rules for Supreme Court nominees to only require a simple majority, and they were able to get Neil Gorsuch onto the Supreme Court. So maybe me telling that story brought up a fear that some people might have about getting rid of the filibuster for legislation. Maybe we're in agreement that the filibuster is bad, but you might be concerned about what the Republican Party will do if Democrats get rid of the filibuster and then ultimately lose control of the government, and the Republicans party no longer has to worry about the filibuster blocking their agenda. There's a good chance that at some point in the future, they're going to take control of the government. And there will be essentially no way from stopping them from pushing through a conservative legislative agenda. I have a couple of thoughts on that. It's not a totally unfounded fear. First, I would say that I don't really think there is a Republican legislative agenda. Aside from cutting taxes and seating conservative judges, both of which can be done without the 60-vote majority for cloture, they are just more than happy to just keep obstructing and watch the country flail about without federal action, and then say that the government is terrible at getting those things done. We saw when they took control of the government in 2016 that uh, they really just did not have a plan for what they wanted to do legislatively. Even their signature policy agenda of getting rid of the Affordable Care Act, they really just did not have a good way of doing that. They had thought they had complained about it for years, but they had never had a suitable replacement that could make it through the Senate. And the second point to that is that to the extent that the Republicans have a legislative agenda, it's almost entirely extremely unpopular in this country. Um, they couldn't get a bare majority to repeal the Affordable Care Act. And for their trouble, they ended up doing terribly in the 2018 midterms. And if they had actually succeeded in repealing the Affordable Care Act, they probably would have done even worse. So maybe the best thing to do, in my opinion, is to let voters decide who should control the government, and then judge them on what they actually get done. So if I'd given this talk a year ago, I probably would have said that the Democratic leadership was generally opposed to ending the filibuster for legislation. Over the past few months, though, we've started to see that position shift a little. At Representative John Lewis's funeral, President Obama gave a eulogy, and he supported ending the filibuster if that's the only way to get voting rights legislation passed. Um, During the presidential primary, uh, Senator Bernie Sanders was generally opposed to getting rid of the filibuster. He said so during the debate and in interviews. But recently, he did also come out in support of President Obama's assertion that if we need to get rid of the filibuster to pass a new Voting Rights Act, then we should go ahead and do that. President-elect Joe Biden has previously as well been against getting rid of the filibuster. But recently it seems like that position is at least starting to soften on his part, depending on how obstructionist the Senate Republicans are, and I have no reason to think that they won't be. He may actually be in favor of getting rid of the filibuster going forward. And then finally, this shift in the Democratic Party has really been accelerated by the nomination of an eventual confirmation of Amy Coney Barrett to replace Ruth Bader Ginsburg on the Supreme Court. That happened less than 2 months before the presidential election this year. But in 2016, when Antonin Scalia died, 9 months before the presidential election, Mitch McConnell refused to even consider replacing him until no new president was in office. So I think that the Democratic Party, their leadership, they're finally waking up to the fact that the Republican Party does not care about norms. They don't care about being hypocrites. They only care about passing their agenda, and they'll take advantage of every opportunity they are given to do so. And if getting rid of the filibuster stands in the way, they will get rid of it without hesitation. I don't think that they will anytime soon because of the issues with their agenda that I mentioned earlier. But if it ever becomes advantageous for them to get rid of the filibuster, they will find an excuse to get rid of it. But right now, as things stand, Joe Biden has won the White House. The Democrats are keeping the majority in the House, although it's a much slimmer majority than they had previously. But control over the Senate is still up in the air, and that'll be determined by two runoff elections happening in Georgia on January 5th. So things are still uncertain as to whether or not Democrats will even control the Senate. In the best case scenario, they'll control exactly half of the seats in the Senate, with Vice President Harris breaking any ties. And since some of those votes are going to have to come from more conservative Democrats like Joe Manchin from West Virginia, it's a pretty bleak best case scenario for getting rid of the filibuster. It'll make the kind of reforms I'm talking about just much more difficult, if not impossible, in the short term. So we're probably not going to see any real progressive legislation passed anytime soon. But the more important point that I want to make here today is that we're never, ever going to see progressive legislation unless we start thinking much more about how the government actually works than we do about what our dream policy initiatives will be. During the presidential primary debates, every one of the nominees had an expansive policy agenda. Everyone had things that they wanted to get done, but many of them thought that getting rid of the filibuster was a bad idea. And at this point, if a Democratic politician says that they're going to get legislation passed and they're against ending the filibuster, then frankly, they are lying, they are delusional, or they are wrong. I would include in that Joe Biden, I would include Bernie Sanders, Kamala Harris, Cory Booker, all of whom expressed reservations about ending the filibuster during the debates. Although, as I said, their positions are starting to soften a little bit. If they're not talking about getting rid of the filibuster, then they're not actually talking about passing legislation. So going forward, the best thing that you can do, from my perspective on this, if you agree with me that getting rid of the filibuster is a good idea, is that you can contact your senator and tell them you don't want another administration going by without getting anything done. In Pennsylvania, as far as I can tell, so Senator Casey has previously opposed ending the filibuster, and I haven't seen anything that indicates that he's changed that position. I could be wrong about that, but certainly contacting his office if you're from Pennsylvania and telling him it's time to end the filibuster would be an important step. I would also note that in 2 years, Senator Toomey, the Republican senator from Pennsylvania, is not going to be running for reelection. So that would be another opportunity to get a Democratic senator from Pennsylvania, and during the election to try to get them to commit to ending the Senate filibuster. So I just saw that question. I'm about to wrap up, and then I'll answer questions. So just to wrap things up, it's something I want to think about is that there was a brief period of time when Barack Obama controlled the White House, the Democrats controlled the House, and 60 seats in the Senate, and we did get the Affordable Care Act, but it was a slog because of the cloture requirements, and because of the time it took to get passed. Conservatives were able to flood the media with a parade of horribles about socialized medicine, and they really made the Democrats look bad for trying to give healthcare to the American people. The cloture requirement didn't help anyone. It didn't help make the legislation any better. It didn't foster any bipartisanship. It just tainted the entire process. And that was with 60 Democratic votes in the Senate. We can't afford to wait for the Democrats to once again have 60 votes in the Senate. We definitely can't wait for Mitch McConnell to have a change of heart and start negotiating in good faith. There's important work to be done in this country, and unless the filibuster is eliminated, it's simply never going to happen. So thank you for listening, and if there are any questions, you can, I see there's a couple questions in the channel. You can also unmute yourself if you like. But I saw a question that what is good about the filibuster? I think that the main argument in favor of the filibuster is that it prevents a simple majority in the Senate from just running roughshod over the rest of the country. That's less of a problem to my mind if Democrats are controlling the Senate, but based on population, the Republicans should have many fewer seats in the Senate. But because the Senate seats are not proportional to population in the state, they have a lot of power compared to how many people actually voted for them. So as I said before, if the Republican Party did take control of the Senate and the filibuster wasn't there, it would mean that potentially a much smaller a minority of the population would be controlling the legislative agenda that would affect the entire country. So that's certainly a problem. my reasoning is that I think we just kind of need to start actually passing legislation and judging the parties based on what they get done. But I would say that that's the major argument for the existence of the filibuster. What has to happen for us to eradicate the filibuster? Okay, so what we're asking our senators to do is to use what I termed earlier as the nuclear option. It's a weird kind of parliamentary way of doing things. It feels kind of wrong, but it's really the only way that we're going to actually get rid of the filibuster. So basically, what we're asking our senators to do is to, if Kamala Harris is willing to interpret the rules as requiring only a simple majority to invoke cloture, what we need the Senate to do is not overrule her, because that's a power that the Senate has. The president of the Senate can issue rulings, and if a simple majority of the Senate disagrees with the president, they can overrule them. So that's what we're really asking, is for senators in the Democratic Party to support that interpretation of the rules. I know it's a strange way of doing things. I'd rather do things by actually changing the real Senate rules, but that would require, I believe it takes a 2/3 majority to change the Senate rules. So that's definitely never going to happen. Most of your arguments with regard to social issues. What about financial foreign policy arenas where progressive agendas are not reliable principles by which to navigate granular problems? Well, the one thing I would say about that is that, honestly, even if we get rid of the filibuster, a lot of the progressive legislation that I might have talked about earlier is still not going to happen, especially not if it comes down to a 50-50 split in the Senate. There's just too many Democrats from redder states, from purple states, that are not going to want to sign on to ultra progressive legislation. And in general, in terms of foreign policy, honestly, the Senate as a whole is much more conservative in terms of foreign policy than in terms of domestic policy. The Republicans and the Democrats are, in a lot of ways, not that far apart when it comes to foreign policy. Now, a lot of that I may disagree with, but I wouldn't. If you're concerned about a more progressive legislative agenda when it comes to foreign policy, I wouldn't be as worried about that if you're concerned, because for example, Donald Trump moved our embassy in Israel to Jerusalem, which was considered there was a lot of outcry about that decision. But the fact of the matter is that Democrats have been wanting that to happen asking for that to happen for years. It's mainly just because it was Donald Trump doing taking that particular action that it got as much negative attention as it did. But really, Democrats were in support of that kind of move. As far as financial, I would disagree about progressive agendas not being reliable. That's a debate we can continue having in the Discord channel. And we're just about out of time, but I'm happy to keep talking about this in Discord as we go forward.
Michael, I don't mean to interrupt. There was one question above that from Kristen Thompson. Is it possible to change the rules about cloture? What if debate ended based on a timer, so that you didn't have that hold or threat that was allowed?
Right. So that might be a little bit more nuanced than they'd be able to achieve with just through interpretation. I would certainly favor other alternatives to getting rid of the filibuster, but I think that in general, the main way that people are thinking about this is just to make invoking cloture require only 51 votes in the Senate. And then that would sort of put a timer on things, because once you invoke cloture, then you have 30 hours of debate to debate the bill before moving on to a vote. So that does already kind of put a timer on there. I'm sure there's other ways of doing things, but I think that if this were to happen, the form it would take would just say invoking cloture is now only takes 51 votes. So we wouldn't actually be eliminating cloture or changing the debate rules. It would just be about reducing that cap. Isn't the real issue not blue versus red, but about big money versus small money? I'm not as sure about that. I think one of the things you might have noticed from this past election is that a lot of money went into to help Democratic senators facing off against Democratic challengers to Republican senators, such as against Lindsey Graham or against Mitch McConnell, and they lost. And that was a lot of money that Democrats wasted because I think that we tend to worry about the power that money has in elections, and certainly in smaller elections like state and local elections, a little bit of money goes a long way. But I think that in general, that problem is maybe a little bit overblown, and I think that our last election kind of demonstrates that. But I'm happy to continue that discussion in the channel as well.
Unfortunately, we are at time.
Well, thank you everyone for joining me. I really enjoyed putting together this talk.
That was great. Thank